Hello and welcome to Total Education Media Centre. My name is Bruce Pattinson and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Blade Runner. More specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about Roy Batty and Eldon Tyrell and doing a compare and contrast about those two characters and integrating that into the whole of Blade Runner. We meet Eldon Tyrell early in the film and certainly he plays an important role. He's the creator of the Nexus 6, which is really what the film's all about. And we see him in that initial early setting. We don't see him specifically, but we do see the giant edifice that he's built to his own importance in that Mayan, or some people call it Egyptian style pyramid at the start of the film. And as we pan in and see that gigantic building, we know it's important, and then we cut in and eventually we meet him, the owner of the company, the Tyrell Corporation, that has built the Nexus 6 and made everything so, I don't know, important in commercial terms, and made everything so empty and hollow in his life and in the lives of everyone who seems to be left on Earth. And it's a nice comparison to look at him and his character and Roy Batty and Roy's character and compare the two, and we work out that although Eldon Tyrell is the creator of Roy, we seem to think that he has less human qualities perhaps than Roy does, and very specifically and clearly we know that there's a great differentiation between the two. I'd like to explore that connection and some of the connections to the film tonight when I talk to you, and I'd like to talk about Tyrell's character, and I'd like to start doing that with a quote from the film, and you can download the film script and get these quotes yourself. Tyrell says early to Deckard when they're talking about Rachel at the start of the film, "Commerce is our goal here at Tyrell. More human than Newman is our motto. Rachel is an experiment, nothing more. We begin to recognise in them strange obsessions. After all, they are emotionally inexperienced, with only a few years in which to store up the experiences which you and I can take for granted. If we give them the past, we create a cushion or pillow for their emotions, and consequently we can control them better." And Deckard goes on to talk about how, you know, it's memories that really he's talking about and what he gives them. So Tyrell clearly there says commerce, materialism, consumerism is what drives him. So his scientific background and his ability to create these things has been warped by the sense of commercially driven control. And we see that later on when he meets Roy in that great classic scene. Tyrell's not a likeable character. Physically, he's inferior to the replicants that he created, and certainly physically he's far inferior to Roy, his prime creation, the Nexus 6. Tyrell's eyesight's poor, as we see from the thick Coke bottle glasses. Physically he's small, he's weedy, his voice is small, and he's sort of got a very arrogant manner about him for a man who's physically so inferior, and that's because he is the scientific genius, he is the boss of the company, he's the creator as in such, and possibly this is, you know, as we see in many of those types of people, it's overblown ego that's more important to him than anything else, and he's not typically a man that we'd like. He has lack of emotion, definitely lack of emotion, as we see with his response to Rachel there when he says she's just an experiment to him, and his callousness and his lack of feeling enables us to dislike him intensely, and we do in the film, and I think Ridley Scott portrays this very clearly and develops the ideas behind that throughout the film when we hear little bits about Tyrell and we see him, and we build to that culminating scene where Roy returns and meets him, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. He's very proud of the Nexus 6, and probably we should talk here a little bit about the Nexus 6, and Roy is a Nexus 6, a replicant, which is the top model, and part of, I suppose, the driving force in the film for their return is that Roy's got a termination date, and it's very soon, and he brings back his friends, and we see Roy develop. He's physically a level A replicant, as we see from the little computer, the old-fashioned computer screen printout, and we see that he's also a level A mentally. His function was combat, colonisation and defence, and as a replicant, Roy is, and we can say this very clearly, more human than his creator, and definitely more human than many of the characters that we see on Earth. I mean, obviously all that's left on Earth are the physically inferior people, or people who can't afford to get off world. For example, Gat with his gammy leg, and he walks with a cane, and obviously he's physically impaired in some way and he can't actually get off. And we see that many of these people are vaguely dysfunctional. Roy stands out among those people as a soldier, a warrior, a sort of philosopher, a poet, and his main aim and his only aim is to get life and keep life. And I think that's very important in the fact that he's wanted on Earth because he's used his abilities to kill and get back to Earth, and that's obviously a bad thing. They don't want replicants on Earth, especially ones of Roy's quality, because he's more human than human. You can't tell him apart. And certainly we see Rachel's test where she takes longer than any other replicant to be found out, so to speak, through that Voight-Kampff test. Now, I want to talk very clearly and very specifically about how these two characters are polar opposites and how we can fit that into the scene. And obviously much of the setting, and we see that in the initial scene, that the darkness and the fire and all those sorts of things, and we have the symbols that carry through. And I'll talk very clearly about those symbols in another lecture, and certainly the lecture that's given by one of our university experts on the website very clearly goes through all the symbols, the fan, the photograph, the eyes, and all those sorts of things. So if you want to log onto the website, you can certainly download those notes. There are study notes for Blade Runner, and there's certainly a lecture you can listen to MP3 format that you can download there, and that gives you more detail about those things and things that you can go into more detail in than these short 15-minute lectures. So let's specifically talk now about when Roy meets Tyrell and they go up to there. That initial scene is set, and it gives a very religious feel with the candles, and I think that's a very important thing because there's obviously lots of religious imagery in the film, and I think Tyrell's room filled with the candles gives it almost a godlike or an altar-like status, and we get that churchy feel from that, the amount of light and the soft light that he has in there. And it's very important that when he comes, he has that a sort of confidence until Roy really pushes him, and then he backs away. I think it's important that the robes he's in are very priest-like robes, and he sort of is a god in many ways, but a flawed god. And he says, "I can't save you. I am not that god." And he says, "While I'm your maker, I can't help you with your longevity." And he has the arrogance to say, "You were made as well as we could make you." He has the problem. He says, "It's out of my jurisdiction. It's not really me who can help you." And Roy says, "I want my life." And they go through, and we see then Tyrell try and talk to him about science. And Roy is very intelligent, and we see that through his need for life, he's obviously done some work and some research about what he is and how to save himself, because they talk about scientific things like EMS recombination, ethyl methane sulfonate. They talk about repressive proteins. They go through all those things, DNA strands, and they talk that science talk that those sorts of people like Tyrell like to talk about so much, and I think that's important. When I made my notes on this, I thought very clearly about why Roy returns, and obviously there's the prodigal son reference, and I don't have time to go into the story of the prodigal son, but it's clear, it's obviously a clear biblical reference, and it ties into the idea of the candles and the godlike figure that Tyrell thinks he is. But the prodigal son story, the son returns to the father after spending time away, after he's squandered his inheritance. It's a nice reversal of that, and you need to know that story and work out what sort of reversal and what Ridley Scott's really trying to say in that scene, and I think that's exceptionally important. The other thing is when they talk about that nothing can be done, Tyrell tries to talk down to him, and he really does. The word I used here was condescending in many ways, and the frustration builds in him so well. And the way that Tyrell talks down to Roy is if he's still a thing, and it's patently clear to us as an audience that Roy is no longer a thing, he's no longer a replicant. We know from watching the whole film that he says we're not machines, we're flesh, and he points that out clearly to J.F. Sebastian. Tyrell eventually says to him, and I want to read this quote because it's quite important. He says to him in a really condescending sort of way, "The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and you have burned so very brightly, Roy. Look at you. You're the prodigal son. You're quite a prize." And I think that quote tells us very clearly that Tyrell still sees Roy as an object. He doesn't have enough emotion in himself, and he doesn't have enough feelings in himself to see it. And remember, Tyrell's a very isolated figure in the film, and I think that's very important to point out, that he's built this giant building as a monument to his own importance, and he sort of walks around in it alone. He's got this huge room and a huge bed, and he's got all sorts of things, and the wealth and the power to do anything he wants, but he has no friends. And he communicates with J.F. Sebastian playing chess over the phone. They don't even do it, and the only reason he lets him up there is because Roy actually does it, but beats him at chess. And he can't believe it because it so rarely happens. And that just shows, again, it's another example of how intelligent Roy is, that he's able to beat his own maker at chess, a game that obviously he prides himself on. So what is it about Roy that makes us like him, despite the fact that he goes around killing people? And he does so very brutally, and the eyes are obvious a connection, and I talked about that in another lecture, and certainly the lecture on the website does that for you. Roy is the soldier philosopher, and I think we see him at his best at the end of the film. He goes back, and certainly he's devastated when he finds Priest dead, and we see him grieving for her in a very particular way, and he finds it a very emotional moment. And then they have that beautiful, Ridley Scott does that beautiful role reversal where Deckard becomes the hunted rather than the hunter, and Roy becomes the hunter, and he gets very physical as he sees his decline, and he moves into that, let's get the gear off, I'm an animal, I'm a wolf, I am back to that primal state. And that shows his deep humanity in many ways, that he reverts back to that. We also, again, and you might like to think about this very carefully, he gets that nail and puts it to his hand, and that religious imagery of the crucifixion, and it's like Roy then becomes a sacrifice to science and technology. And what a sacrifice it is, because as he says very clearly, and he wants to leave a legacy, and he saves Deckard's life just before this moment, and you wonder why he saves Deckard's life. And I think it's because, and this is only my opinion of course, that it's a legacy that he needs to leave, and by saving a life it shows how much he loved life and how much he wanted life. And I think that brings us into connection with Roy very clearly. We also, just before, have that image of the dove, and that the dove is very clear. And you know, whatever connections you make with that, the religious imagery of the pride and everything. And Roy says to him, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watch sea beams glitter in the darkness at Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain, time to die." And then he dies very slowly, and Deckard can do nothing to help him. We see Tyrell die and we see Roy die, and Tyrell dies a horrible death, yet we feel more sympathy for Roy, certainly. And I want you to look at and explore the continuum of those two characters. They're very polar opposites, and he does that not just with their characters but with the setting and the things they do, and you should really focus on that. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but really explore those two characters and explore what they offer to the film and the connections certainly between creator and created. This is Bruce Pattinson signing off for the Total Education Centre. Don't forget to like us down below and visit the website so we can keep these videos coming to you. Thank you.